Hi. Okay. So normally I encourage people to ask questions whilst I'm presenting. Feel free to do that. I'll repeat the questions, but you're spread out over large space. So speak up if you do want to ask a question and raise your hand clearly. Okay. So my name's Gardler. I work for a company called Microsoft Open Technologies Incorporated. I'll tell you a little bit about them in a moment. I'm an open source guy, have been all my career in IT. I'm very heavily involved with the Apache Software Foundation and a number of other projects around and about. And of course, I'm here today to talk about Puppet, specifically Puppet in the Microsoft ecosystem. So why are we interested in this kind of thing at Microsoft? Really, I have to tell you about Microsoft Open Technologies. How many people here have heard of Microsoft Open Technologies before? Okay, not a lot of you. The number does go up each time I ask that question, but not a lot of you. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft. We have our independent rhythm. We work independently of any of the product groups, but our board of directors is made up of representatives from across Microsoft as a whole. And our focus is on interoperability between non-Microsoft and Microsoft technologies. And so that's where we're at. That's what we do. We contribute to open source projects. We contribute to open standards. We engage with the communities. And we try and make sure that where the customer, whether that be a customer of Puppet, a customer of yours, or a customer of ours, can get what they need from the various technologies involved. And Puppet Enterprise are one of the technologies that we're very, very interested in. So why do we need interoperability between these different platforms? First of all, heterogeneity. I mean, we all know this. Developers use X technologies, testers use Y. In deployment, we use Z. If we're bringing in new teams, then we'll probably be introducing new technologies. And we need to be able to support all of those different technologies. And Puppet is, of course, one of the tools that can be used to do that. The other thing that's important in the context of Puppet and interoperability is the ability to maximize choice. It was talked about in one of the keynotes this morning that today everybody's using technology A. Next month, technology B might be a drop-in replacement that's cheaper, so we want to move that way. And in a year's time, technology C might be the only way we want to go. And we have no idea what the future holds for us. And so we need to be able to maximize choice and be able to change those technologies in and out as required for each individual situation that we face. So what's our approach to interoperability? How do we provide that kind of flexibility at OpenTech? Well, one way we do it is through partnerships. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. We're partnering with Puppet Labs. I'm going to talk about some of the outputs from that partnership to ensure that we can bring the innovation that you see in organizations like Puppet Labs and within the community that's built up around Puppet. We can bring those innovations into the Microsoft ecosystem. And where it's appropriate, we can build complementary features into the Microsoft ecosystem so that people who are using Puppets can take advantage of whichever environment they want to work with on any given project. And the key focus is about customers. As I said before, that might be our customers, it might be your customers, it might be Puppet Labs customers. Sorry. So I've already mentioned MS Open Tech and what we do and our approach. The most important things within this community is we take a code talks approach. We're about contributing code to the open source projects so that you can do what you need to do, you can modify that code, et cetera, and all the advantages that we're all familiar with around the open source approach. Why Puppet Labs plus Microsoft Azure? Well, I'll go very quickly over this stuff. I mean, basically, Microsoft has a lot of experience with dealing with enterprise IT pros and developers. Puppet Labs are focusing on delivering operational agility at enterprise class service levels. Open technologies are able to be very, very agile in their engagement with the open source communities and open source projects. And then, of course, Microsoft Azure is a cloud solution for the enterprise. So bringing all of these things together is beneficial to all of us. The goal is to provide that agility that we were talking about through interoperability, that agility for our customers. So for the rest of this session, I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've done. I welcome questions about the stage that we're at in creating that interoperability. I welcome suggestions for people who've used some of these technologies as where we ought to go. And most importantly, I want to appeal to everybody within the community to take part and contribute to the code that we're producing here. It is all open source. It is all available in the appropriate places and in the Puppet Forge, etc. And so the goal here is really to raise awareness of what's possible today and look at where we ought to go in the future together as a community. So the first thing that we need to do, or the first thing we're going to look at least, is how to create a Puppet Master using Puppet Enterprise on Microsoft Azure. Our goal here was to make it as easy as possible for somebody to get a Puppet Master running on Microsoft Azure. And we worked with Puppet Labs to integrate it into the Microsoft Azure portal. This is a screenshot of the current portal. It's also integrated into the preview portal. If any of you have seen that, it's much prettier than this, but the functionality remains the same. So what we do is we go into the portal, we click New in the bottom corner, and we get a wizard up. We select Compute Virtual Machine from Gallery, and we're provided with a list of possible virtual machines we can run. And in that list, you'll find Puppet Labs. And today, it's Puppet Enterprise 3.2.3. So we select that. We click Next. And then we have some basic information that we need to fill out about that VM. Things like the virtual machine name, what it's going to be called in our portal, the username, the password, SSH keys, that kind of thing. A second page of configuration information, DNS name, what data center you want it hosted in, what storage account you want to use, what endpoints need to be open on that machine. Most of these things are pre-configured for you. You can adjust them or go with the defaults. And then you click the tick on the last box, and you take them back to the portal. After a short amount of time, the machine is provisioned, and you have a Puppet Master running in Azure. Now, that takes away all of the configuration that you need to do to get Puppet Master running. Anybody who's tried to install Puppet Enterprise from scratch will know that whilst it's not hugely complex, it's not the simplest of processes. There's dependencies you have to put in, there's configuration, etc. All that's been done for you. The password you need to log into the portal is important, of course. That's the one hoop that you have to jump through. You have to SSH into the machine, run a grep command, which is the one on the screen here, on the configuration files, and find the password that was randomly created when you deployed that image. Once you have the password, you're now just working with a standard Puppet Enterprise console. You log into it as normal, and you interact with it as normal. The fact that it's in Microsoft Azure is irrelevant from this point forwards. You can still use the Azure Management Portal to manage the machine if you want to, or you can use you can SSH in and manage it manually. You can use Puppet, of course, to manage it, and so on and so forth. So we've made it as easy as possible to create Puppet Enterprise masters on Azure. But what about creating VMs? Well, we'll very quickly do the same thing looking at how we create a Windows VM. What we just did previously was a Linux VM, of course, because that's where Puppet runs. And it's probably important to point out to those of you who weren't aware, Linux is a first-class citizen on Microsoft Azure. There are a number of different flavors that you can run. There are thousands of pre-baked images in a product called VM Depot that you can find, but we'll stay focused on running Puppet today. And in this case, we're going to look at Windows VM. Could just as easily be a Linux VM that you're going to create. Same portal, same starting point, click on New. Same first screen, we want to create a compute resource. We want that to be a virtual machine, and we want to choose it from the gallery. In this case, rather than choosing the Puppet Master image, we're going to go for a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center. Click the next button, and we have essentially the same forms. Fill in the various information that we had before, username, password, machine name, etc. Next screen is also the same kind of information as we had before, DNS name, some endpoint configuration, and so on. Again, this is mostly pre-populated with useful defaults that you can configure. The final page is a little different. You'll see here towards the top, it's the second checkbox down, you have the option of installing an extension on this VM, and in this case, the extension is Puppet Enterprise Agent. So if you tick that box, it tells Azure that when you've deployed this machine, can you please install the Puppet agent for us? The eagle-eyed people will notice you can put other configuration management systems on there, but I will continue talking about Puppet here. So once you've done that, you fill in the URL at the bottom of that page where it says, OK, where's your Puppet Master server? Fill in the URL. In this case, it's the URL of the machine we created a moment ago. Click the tick to say I'm done. And same process. You wait for a while for the machine to provision and for the agent to install. And at this point, you're back in the world of Puppet. You go back to your master, and after a period of time, your node will check in and say, hey, I'm supposed to be being managed by you. You go in, you click on the node request, you approve the request just as you would do in any normal, any other Puppet enterprise environment. And once you've done that, you're using Puppet Master just like you would in any other environment. So again, the focus here is making it as easy as possible. Now, why would we do it manually, clicking boxes, filling in things by hand, etc.? Well, there's two reasons. Firstly, some people like to do that. We want to automate in most cases, though, and I'll talk a little bit later on about other ways that we can do this in a more automated fashion. OK, I'm going to go very quickly over the next few slides, because ultimately these are about selling Azure to you, and that's really not what I'm here for. I want to talk about the interoperability. So the unique Azure value is about hyperscale cloud. It's about enterprise grade. It's about hybridity. The only one of those I really want to talk about is hybridity. We have 16 data centers around the world. There is this one I quite like, the hyperscale. This is just a couple of items that the Azure team put forward as an example of that. We ran the NBC Olympics. Thousands, millions, I think, people watching streaming and recorded video for NBC Olympics went without a hitch. Games like Titanfall, hundreds of thousands of servers at launch went without a hitch, etc. Most of us don't need this kind of scale, but it's reassuring to know that we can go to this kind of scale without any problem. What's more important, perhaps, for this audience, though, is the hybrid environment. So by hybrid, I mean that you can have it on-premise or off-premise. We can provide the same tooling to work on-premise in your own data centers as you use to manage your cloud environment. We also provide lots of SDKs and configuration tools in lots of different languages so that you can work with whatever tools and environments you want. So PHP, Node.js, Java, Ruby, Python, many others. Of course, .NET is also in there as well. So you get to choose the tools that are most appropriate for your team and the project that you're dealing with. OK, so enough already of the sales pitches and the things about Azure. Let's come back to Puppet and what we've done with Puppet Labs and the integrations that we've created there. People want to know, OK, so how easy is it to install and manage workloads using Puppet on Azure? Well, we've seen that with the Puppet Master. If you can use Puppet, you can use Puppet to manage workloads on Azure. Can you manage both Windows and Linux? I've already answered that question. Yes, you can. What modules exist for managing Windows? Can I use other common DevOps tooling in conjunction with Puppet? Does the dev team have to move to Windows if they're going to do something like this? What about the testers? What about everybody else? There's many questions like this, and I'll answer those as we go through in the rest of this session. So let's think about a scenario. So the title of this talk is From Development Through Testing to Deployment. Let's start at the developer. And the key point of this scenario is that we're not just working with isolated technologies like Puppet, we're working with other complementary technologies to ensure that full tool chain, those innovations that are happening, are being brought to our environment, and you can use what you need to use to get your job done. So let's consider our dev lead, Jane. She wants to ensure that all of her development team have the same development environment. She wants to be able to configure it in a consistent way. She also wants to be able to share that configuration with the testing team who want to use a cloud provider to be able to spin up images and bring them down during the testing stages. And then later on, you want to use the same configuration to go into deployment. You know, this is what Puppet is around for, or at least part of what Puppet is around for. So Jane chooses to use Vagrant. How many people are familiar with Vagrant? Okay, about half of you. I'll give you a very quick introduction to Vagrant for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's a great tool for managing development environments in a consistent way. Basically, it provides you with a way of packaging up virtual machines and then using those in any environment, whether it be Mac OS, whether it be Windows, whether it be Linux, almost any hypervisor, and as we'll see later, cloud providers as well. So Jane's on a Windows box. Okay, she's got people in her team, remember, who are using Mac and Linux and so on. She doesn't want people to have to reskill and learn new tools. She just wants people to be able to work in a consistent environment. So in Jane's case, she needs to activate Hyper-V. She needs to download Vagrant, very quick and easy install to do. There's no complexities in doing that. And now she's ready to go. She creates a directory for her project. She runs a command Vagrant init. And then the last part there is the name of a base box, an initial Windows box, Ubuntu box that she wants to work with. The reason I've picked this one is because it happens to come with Puppet pre-installed, so I don't have to do anything to get the Puppet agent on there, but I could choose any VM and put Puppet on manually. There are various ways that you can do that using Vagrant. The result of that command is to create what's called a Vagrant file. And the Vagrant file defines what this box is going to look like. And then she runs the command Vagrant up, which means bring up the virtual machine, dash provider equals Hyper-V. In other words, I want to run it on Hyper-V. Vagrant goes out to what's called the Vagrant cloud, says I want this base box, I want it to run on Hyper-V. It downloads it, and it brings it up and runs it. Now I can use SSH, I can type Vagrant SSH, and I've SSH'd into the box. Now remember, Jane is on a Windows machine here. She doesn't have to use SSH. She can go in through the Hyper-V management console, or she can install something like MinGW or any of the environments that bring SSH with them, and she can use SSH on the command line. I'll come back to the last point on that shortly. Of course, we want to version control everything. We want our configuration to be stored in code somewhere so that our developers can just check that out and work with it. So we put it into version control, which is all that's happening with these commands. What happened there? Now, we want to use Puppet to configure that machine. So what we do is we go into our Vagrant file and we say config.vmprovision :Puppet, which says, use Puppet to configure this machine for me. We make a manifests folder, and in that manifest folder, we make our default.pp file. And at this point, you're just writing standard Puppet manifests. Nothing complicated. I'm not going to talk about what would go in there because we're at PuppetConf. You either know this or you've attended lots of sessions that tell you what would go in a file like that. We reload the VM with a Vagrant command. It provisions it using Puppet, and we're off. Once we know it works, we commit it into Git. Our other developers can then check that out and update. Now, the important thing here is that because we're using Vagrant, we've got a few niceties that are brought to us. The first one is that on the guest machine, /Vagrant is now mapped to the directory that we're working in on our host machine. And we can use our host tooling. Jane's in Windows, so let's assume she's using Visual Studio. She can use Visual Studio to do her editing. Somebody else in the team might be using Mac. Somebody else in the team might be using Linux. And they can use whatever tooling they want to work with the files that are on that guest. There's no learning curve for anybody who's coming new into the team. And also, there's no discussions, there's no situations. We say, well, hang on a minute, it works on my machine because everyone's using exactly the same configuration. The one difference that comes in if you want to run with on a Linux machine instead of a Windows machine is the provider you want to use. So VirtualBox is also supported out of the box within Vagrant. So if you're running on Linux or Mac, you can install VirtualBox. You can also install VirtualBox on Windows, of course, and use that instead of Hyper-V. And you do Vagrant up provider equals VirtualBox instead. Actually, you don't need the provider equals VirtualBox because that's the default. And so Vagrant will download the correct base box and then configure it using Puppet. You can then use that same Puppet file to configure your staging servers for testing, etc. But we went a step further than that. We said, OK, how do we get a machine onto Azure? And I promised you earlier I'd show some ways of deploying machines to Azure that are using Puppet for configuration that didn't involve clicking boxes and typing into fields in a web portal. And you can use Vagrant to do that. And the way you do it is you simply use Azure as a different provider. So where we had Hyper-V before, or VirtualBox, we can say provider equals Azure. Within the Vagrant file, we need to configure this. It's very easy to configure it. I'll go over it quickly. We simply enter a section in config.vm.provider, Azure, do, etc. Inside of that section, you provide the information that before we were typing into the portal on the website. So the VM name, the username, the password, where you want it to be hosted, and things like that. You also need to provide some credential information to say which Azure subscription you're going to put this virtual machine into. Once you've done that, you run that Vagrant up command with provider equals Azure, and after a short while, you have the machine running in the cloud, exactly the same configuration your developers were using, and you can do some testing using the cloud infrastructure as necessary. So where do you get the Hyper-V boxes, or the Azure boxes? Well, there's a tool called Packer. Packer is a complementary tool to Vagrant, and Packer enables you to build these boxes. So you can take whatever base image you want, and package it up as a box, and use that within the Vagrant environment. Now, all of the contributions that we've made to Vagrant, Puppet, Azure, Vagrant, Puppet, Hyper-V, Packer, are all under open source licenses. They're all in the appropriate places. So the Packer code is in Packer, the Vagrant code is with Vagrant, and so on. So that's just one example of how you can automate this process. But of course, we're not limited to that. We work with a lot of other projects as well. I wouldn't go so far as to say the chances are whatever you're using we've worked with. I'd like to think that is true. But there's a lot of tools out there, so it's probably not entirely true. But the most common and most popular tools we certainly have worked with. So you can use Docker, you can use PowerShell, not surprisingly, you can use Node.js, and many other systems, many other approaches, such as a Puppet module. So coming back to Puppet again, we've created a Puppet module, which is available in the Puppet Forge, and the code is on GitHub. That enables you to manage Azure resources from within your Puppet manifests. So you can configure and deploy virtual machines. You can manage those machines, virtual networks, SQL databases, storage accounts, cloud services, service bus management, etc. is all available within this Puppet Forge module. The module name is MS OpenText / Microsoft Azure. It's where you would expect it to be on Puppet Forge. Please go there and have a look at it. OK, if you're using Eclipse as your development environment, you have this nice tool to help you work with Puppet manifests from within the IDE. But if you're a Microsoft person and using Visual Studio, you didn't have that until relatively recently. But we built a plugin for Visual Studio as well that is very simple to install. If you know Visual Studio, you probably know how to install extensions. We install that extension, and once it is installed into Visual Studio, you now have a file project new. And within the new, you can choose a Puppet manifest project. And that gives you the kinds of features that you would expect. You enter some basic metadata when you create a new project about what the module is that you're building, some summary information, a description, etc. And then you can edit it using the normal tools. You have code syntax highlighting, etc. Within the editor. And once you're happy with it, you can publish it directly from within Visual Studio to the Puppet Forge. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people who are not working in an environment, a Windows environment and a Microsoft environment, to be able to manage Microsoft platforms, Microsoft tools, and also to use Azure if that's your chosen provider. You can also use all the same tools to work on-premise. And if you are a Visual Studio user, we're providing tools for you to be able to work with Puppet without struggling against the tools. So we heard this morning about supported modules and approved modules. I'm pleased to say that there are a number of supported modules and approved modules that you would be interested in. Unfortunately, clashing with this session is a session on how to manage Windows with Puppet, and in that session they're talking about a lot of the modules that exist for doing that. If you want to know more about that and you're missing that session because you're here, they're doing demos in the demo room regularly on that kind of, on the Puppet modules in Windows. In terms of the supported modules, Puppet Labs have got a number of modules that are very useful in the Windows environment. And of course, you can find those in the Puppet Forge. Simply select supported from the drop-down, select the operating system as Windows, and you'll get a full list of the supported modules available to you. There are only a handful of modules that are approved. It was only announced, I think, yesterday morning. But already there's a couple of approved modules that are compatible in the Windows environment and enable you to use the same modules, same tooling to manage Windows and Linux machines. And of course, there's plenty of community-provided modules as well that you can use to bring parity across the different platforms. So, really what the goal is here, as I said right at the beginning, is we're trying to ensure that Microsoft Open Technologies Incorporated, the company I work for, can provide an agile gateway between Microsoft Corporation and the open source communities and the users of those projects. And that's you. The Microsoft Azure team, they're out there in the exhibition hall. They're making sure that their side of that equation is delivered. So things like integration into the portal that we talked about earlier and the extensions all come from that team working directly with Puppet Labs. And Puppet Labs are really focusing, as you well know, on reducing the friction of technology change. So what this means ultimately is you get that flexibility and that agility in the tooling that you want to use because you can use Puppet, and because Puppet lives up to its promise, you are able to manage different platforms in different environments. So, how do you try it? If you know Puppet already, you can try this just by firing up virtual machines in your test environments and get going straight away. If you want to try it in the cloud, then you need an Azure subscription. There is a free trial offer. If you go to aka.ms/puppet, then you can sign up for a free trial. It'll be 1 month trial, and it'll give you a couple of $100 of credit, which is plenty to experiment with this kind of thing, do some trials, do some testing of your Puppet environment in the cloud. If you are an MSDN subscriber already, you also get a monthly allowance as part of your MSDN subscription. You have to enable it, go to the MSDN site, and you can find that. And that will give you enough to certainly do some testing and so on. On the Puppet Labs site, there is an ever-growing amount of documentation about running Puppet in Azure and managing Windows and Linux environments together, whether that be Azure, whether it be on other cloud providers, or whether it be on your own data centers, your own local machines. If you're interested in the general interoperability work that we're doing, the things like Vagrant and Packer and Docker that we were talking about earlier on, and how that maps to the relationship with the Puppet tooling, then the MS OpenText site is the place that you want to go to. The blog there focuses on giving our announcements, and there's a section for DevOps, which includes all of the kinds of tooling that we're talking about here, and we'll give you an overview of the kind of work that we're doing. Perhaps more important than all that, though, is to recognize that this is open source. I mentioned right at the beginning that I'm an open source guy, have been all my life. I've been with Microsoft for about 18 months now. And I joined Microsoft because they have this organization, Microsoft Open Technologies, who is leveraging the resources of Microsoft in the open source world. Now, that has to be two-way as well. We need to empower the community, we need to empower you, and we need to make sure that if we're not satisfying the needs that you have with the code that we're writing, that either we listen to the problems that, well, we will listen to the problems that you're facing, and either we prioritize them and implement them because we recognize it as a common need, or we help you solve the problem yourself. We help you scratch the itch, as is often said. And that's something that really, that's the gear that we're moving into now. We've built the technology, we've built the contributions, we've written the code that gives a sufficiently complete experience for people to be using this and doing real work with this. Okay, so we want to know now, we want to work with you now to take that to the next step, to solve your specific problems. We're not going to promise to do all the work for you. This is open source. But we are going to promise, and I make that promise now standing here, we are going to make sure that you're able to get any appropriate contributions into that code base and make it what it needs to be for the Puppet community as a whole by serving yourself first. We welcome bug reports. We prefer patches, but hey, bug reports are good. So please do go check the code out on GitHub. Go check what we're doing. Let us know what we've got right. Let us know what we've got wrong. And let's work together on making this all move forwards. OK, because I went very quickly over the salesy stuff, I've actually finished 7 minutes early. And we have plenty of time on the thing. So if you want the sales pitch, I'll give it you now as well. But I'm not very good at sales, so. Any questions about what we're doing, where we're going? Yeah, we have a question over here. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Do we have a microphone somewhere? All right, I'll come down and repeat it. What about services? And what kind of services are you thinking?
Cloud services, had the message bus stuff up there, but what about storage services, web workers?
Yep, OK. So I'll come back up to the stage. I'm not sure how the cameras are being worked. So the question is, how about services in general? I mentioned specifically the message bus. What about other services that are available? In the Puppet module, we are supporting some of those services. So SQL Server is another one that we are supporting. You asked specifically about the storage accounts. You can manage storage accounts using the Puppet module. You can't manage every service that's available on Azure. We've really focused on providing some of the base services to provide some code that shows how you would do this. The Azure APIs are all open. There is a Ruby SDK for you to use. There's lots of other SDKs if you want to use it in a different environment. If the service that you need isn't supported, we're back to we prefer patches. But if you have a specific need, then let us know about that need. It might be that we've got 50 people asking us for that same thing and that we want to prioritize it. If you want to have a go at scratching your own itch, you want to try that, let us know what technical support you need. We've got the mailing list there, we've got the issue tracker there. Talk to us through that and we'll try our best to give you the answer. My goal really is to build a real community around this code and all of the other modules that are out there. There are plenty of community-contributed modules. You might find that there's a community module that satisfies your needs. And I want to try and tie all these things together, get all that expertise together so that together we can satisfy all the needs that we have. Any follow-up question or any different questions? Come on, I'm from Microsoft and I'm at an open source conference. How many people are surprised to see somebody from Microsoft at an open source conference? That's great, not many of you. Okay, that's normally, well, not so long ago, most people would have put their hand up. And, you know, I think it's fair now, it's been fair for a long time, to be honest, to recognize the fact that Microsoft is engaging very productively, very hands-on with a code talks approach with the open source communities. In fact, the company always has. It's just not been quite as obvious as it is today. So I'm certainly very pleased to be here and doing this kind of thing. To be able to continue my work in the open source world, in fact, accelerate my work in the open source world as a result of this is great. So, any further questions? I'm getting some hand signals from out there. Nick, are you saying tell them about the stand out there? So Nick Garkusha is at the back there. He clearly wasn't in when I said this earlier, but the Microsoft Azure team are outside. If you have any specific questions about Azure and the services available there, etc., Nick and the team outside are very well equipped to answer those questions. Any further questions here? Okay. I shall come back down to you so we don't have to shout at one another.
So you talked about heterogeneity and stuff like that, but in an enterprise shop, they're going to have tools already like System Center and things like that. So they're going to have that mindset. Why would you say that using Puppet in these modules might be better than using something like System Center?
Okay. So the question was, first of all, an observation that in enterprise and many customer environments that are already using Windows tooling, they've probably got other tools already in place, such as System Center was the example that's given there. And the question, if I understood it correctly, is why would we say, well, Puppet is an alternative, possibly even a better alternative? I think you used the word better. And the answer is that it's not necessarily a better alternative. It depends on the situation. And if somebody's already heavily invested with System Center and is perfectly happy with it, they don't care that we've done this work. But the reality is that there are companies out there who are bringing in engineering teams that have different sets of tools. And those tools aren't System Center. They might be coming from a Java world and a Linux world, and they're bringing those into the company. There's customers who are using System Center and things like that are saying to us, well, hang on, how come we can't do this? I've seen this Puppet thing at PuppetConf the other week, and it was fantastic. Why can't I do that? And we could take the approach of saying, well, let's reinvent all that stuff and do it within System Center. Or we could take the approach of saying, let's partner with Puppet Labs and bring the innovations that are happening in there and align them and make them usable by people who are already in the Microsoft ecosystem. So I don't think we would ever say it's better to use Puppet. I think what we want to do is sit down, and I stress, I'm from Microsoft OpenTech, I don't do customer-facing stuff. But I think that what we would want to do is sit down with them, understand the issues that they're facing, and figure out how best to solve the problem. And if they're bringing in a shop that has Puppet already, the best way of solving the problem isn't to say, get rid of all your Puppet stuff and do System Center. It's, OK, how do we bring these things together? And that's where we're at now with this interoperability work that we've done. We aren't currently integrated with System Center and the Puppet work that we've done. But the infrastructure is in place. And so if customers need that, they can start going in that direction. Now, if you want to know, precisely where we're at on that roadmap, the Azure team outside, we have somebody who's very knowledgeable about our engagement in System Center, and I'm sure they'll be very happy to give you a more detailed answer. I have overtime, please wrap up on my thing. Any last question before they sweep me off with a broom? OK. Thank you very much. I hope to see some of you within the open source projects.